Okay. All right. So we left off with the election of 1800. We're good. So this presidential election is the first time that we have a change from one political party to the other. And a lot of people in America thought that what was going to unfold as a result of this election?
A civil war.
A civil war. Very good. Because no one really knew how this would shake out. So you have the Federalists running John Adams, and you have the Democratic Republicans running Jefferson. Now, it's a little complicated because Jefferson and Aaron Burr, sir, are going to be running as Democratic Republicans, and John Adams and Charles Pinckney, the guy that was responsible for the treaty with Spain, are running as Federalists. Well, Jefferson and Burr in this mudslinging election will ultimately defeat Adams, but it's a tie. And that tie is ultimately going to be broken by Congress. And what will happen is Hamilton will decide that the lesser of the two evils, because he's not a fan of Jefferson nor Burr, he's going to put his support behind Jefferson, Federalists in Congress put their support behind Jefferson, and then this stokes the fire between Hamilton and Burr. Now, that's not the reason that Burr and Hamilton line up in a duel, but it certainly doesn't help matters. Does that make sense? Once this is all said and done, though, this is going to push Congress to pass the 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment is going to be passed in 1804, which basically says that you've got presidential and vice presidential nominees that are going to be voted on separately. This will end the first place vote getter, second place vote getter, and over time this will evolve into a presidential and vice presidential ticket, right, where one group will be elected as opposed to like a first place and a second place vote getter. Does that make sense? Because that's what had happened in 1796 when Adams had won and Jefferson became vice president. So the election of 1800 is considered a monumental election. It leads to a lot of change in the way that the Electoral College will operate, and obviously it pushes for the 12th Amendment. There's only one election in American history, though, that is presidential election that is what is considered a walkover, and that is the election of 1820, where James Monroe ran uncontested. Now, one elector from New Hampshire is going to cast a vote for John Quincy Adams. It was kind of petty. That elector didn't believe that James Monroe should have the distinction of being unanimously elected. But we're not going to see any more walkovers, any more uncontested presidential elections moving forward. In other elections, though, in America, at the local and state level, have we had other uncontested walkovers? Sure. Yeah, that happens. I also wanted to just point out that often when I would teach this, I would kind of like breeze over the 11th Amendment, and then students would be like, wait, what happened to the 11th Amendment? Well, the 11th Amendment was signed as Washington left office before John Adams came in, and it prevented citizens from bringing a lawsuit to states that they were not citizens of. So, a lot of people were trying to test the Constitution during this period of time, so you wouldn't have, a citizen of the state of Virginia take up a lawsuit against the state of New York. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So that's a little bit about the 11th Amendment. Any questions about the election of 1800? All right. So Jefferson is going to be a two-termer from Virginia. He has two vice presidents. His first vice president is Burr, and his second vice president is George Clinton. Obviously, Burr is not going to be vice president in his second term. In the election of 1800, he defeats Burr and Adams. It is the first peaceful change of power. No war will ensue. This will continue at least until the American Civil War, and then we saw the upheaval in 2020 on January 6th. But nearly every American election has led to a peaceful change of power, and it starts in the election of 1800. Some important events. Jefferson, in his first term, will introduce laissez-faire or laissez-faire economics. Are y'all familiar with this, econ students? Do you guys remember learning about Adam Smith, author of Wealth of Nations, Scottish economist? He's kind of like the guy that goes back and says, like, the Columbian Exchange is like the birth of capitalism. But he also talks about in the Wealth of Nations laissez-faire economics, and that is the idea that government governs and business does business in a democratic society and in a capitalistic society. Now, interestingly enough, Jefferson will move away from laissez-faire economics in his second term. We're not done with laissez-faire economics. It comes and goes throughout American history. There are times where we see like government try to wrangle in business, and we'll see times where business has way more power than the government. I mean, we've lived through these periods of time, and we're going to talk about that as we move through the remainder of the course. So, Supreme Court case Marbury v. Madison, the power of judicial review. I'm not going to get too in-depth on Marbury v. Madison today. I'm actually going to get into that next class. But guys, Marbury v. Madison is one of, if not the most important court case to establish the foundation of the Supreme Court. The power of judicial review is what the court has, and it is tested in this case tremendously important. All right, and I'll break it all down for you guys in the next lesson when we start talking about the Marshall Court. Obviously, the most significant event in the Jefferson two-term presidency is going to be the Louisiana Purchase. The initial goal was to just send diplomats to go by New Orleans, but instead they bought all of the Louisiana Territory, doubling the size of the United States. Caused quite a bit of controversy in America. The Native American tribes are living in the region. Bless you. You've got economic controversy over where the money's coming from. You've got political controversy over whether it's constitutional. You also have international drama related to the fact that France was supposed to cede the land back to Spain in 1804. But America ends up making the purchase. Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery will be sent out to explore. I'm actually going to talk about the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark expedition in a little bit more detail momentarily. On the tail end of Jefferson's first term, you got the Burr-Hamilton duel that occurred in July of 1804 on the cliffs of Weehawken, New Jersey. Hamilton offended Burr and his honor. Burr challenges him to a duel. Any idea why they chose New Jersey to have the duel? Because of laws? Is that what you said? Yeah, the dueling laws were more lax in New Jersey. So a lot of people would go over to the cliffs of Weehawken, following the Code Duello. Hamilton misses. Burr hits Hamilton in the abdomen, bleeds out as they cross back over the Hudson to Manhattan, and Burr goes on the run. Yeah.
Is it true that he pointed at the sky?
See, that's the interesting thing about the Code Duello. You have seconds in the Code Duello. So, like, let's say that you and I are going to duel, right? And I've chosen Hunter as my second, chosen GG as your second, and what they're going to try to do is negotiate a deal where we never have to shoot at each other. But then, if we're not satisfied and we still decide to duel, you have to have witnesses, right? But witnesses tended to show up with like umbrellas, so they could say, "Oh, I didn't actually really see what happened." So if you got, caught in a court of law over the duel, no one would really be able to expose. So yeah, there's a lot of speculation that looms about like whether. The other thing that you all have to understand too is that these dueling pistols don't have hair triggers yet. So the force to pull the trigger took quite a bit of force, and most of these dueling pistols are smooth bore. So that's like the equivalent of like throwing like a knuckle curveball, just kind of goes all over the place. So a lot of duels people were satisfied because either they didn't duel or they would just like fire to miss. Maybe Burr was shooting to miss and actually hit him. We don't know, right? But does that help clear things up? Remember Joseph J. Ellis's Founding Brothers? There's a whole chapter in that book dedicated to the Code Duello and the Hamilton-Burr duel, if you're interested in checking it out. Similar thing happens to Jefferson that happened to Washington. Jefferson's first term is a whole lot more smooth than the second. His second term is totally like marred with this sort of trade battle between and freedom of the seas between Mediterranean pirates, the barbarian pirates. That happened in his first term. But now it gets even worse because, remember, England and France are at war. Both England and France have gotten into the habit of seizing American shipping. So to try to stay out of the war with England and France and to try to prevent American shipping from being seized, Jefferson's going to pass two laws. First, the Embargo Act, which will cut off trade with both France and England, and then a follow-up law known as the Non-Intercourse Act that will just cut off trade with everyone. Well, how do you think that went economically? It was a disaster. And it ultimately led to a what? Well, it does pull us into a war. But before it pulls us into a war, what would happen if you just cut off your trade with everyone?
You also don't get back.
Right, you can't move any products. So now you're going to move into a what, and then ultimately a what? Very good. A recession, and then they move into a depression. What we're going to end up with as a result of these is an economic panic. And by the time Jefferson's second term is coming to an end, he's not looking for a third term. And his Secretary of State, James Madison, is going to become our fourth president. Whoever out there said war, though, good job. Because what this will do is it will ultimately pull us into the War of 1812, which is the direction we're heading in. Any questions about Jefferson's presidency? All right. So the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson makes the purchase from France for $15 million, doubling the size of the U.S. As I've already mentioned, both politically and economically controversial because it was obviously a huge question mark as to whether or not it was constitutional to make the purchase. And all that money is coming from a lot of it's coming from Well, some of it's coming from tax revenue, but a lot of it's coming from the stores of the Bank of the United States. Jefferson will authorize the expedition of Lewis and Clark and the core discovery. They actually set out originally from Pittsburgh down the Ohio, but there's this huge ceremony that's held in St. Louis, Missouri, that they go up the Missouri River. They're interacting with Native American tribes the whole way up. It's unbelievable that they all didn't get wiped out. Does anybody want to take a wild guess about how many out of like the roughly 50 died on the expedition? 40? 45?
37.
37? One.
Oh.
One guy died. Charles Floyd died of appendicitis. Isn't that crazy? Of all the ways to die out there, one guy died of appendicitis. So, just one guy. Yeah. So, the journey out, a lot of very close calls with not only native tribes, but also wildlife. In the winter of 1804 and 1805, they'll encamp with the Mandan and the Dakotas. This is where they meet Sacagawea, Shoshone woman who becomes their interpreter and their guide. She saves the expedition on multiple occasions, notably in the Big Sky country when they're like in need of horses. She goes and meets with the Shoshone and finds out that her brother's the chief. They get resupplied. They move to the Pacific. They manage to survive the Columbia River to reach the Pacific. The trip back was a lot more dicey. They actually ended up tangling part of the party tangled with a tribe on the way back, and that was a pretty close call. But over a 2-year period, they only lost one member of the crew, and it's an amazing trek. They bring back maps, journals, prairie dogs, magpies, bears, like all kinds of stuff. It's kind of crazy. Native American artifacts, mastodon bones, like all kinds of stuff. So, yeah, pretty wild. If you ever go back to Monticello, just kind of take a look around and you'll notice some of the artifacts from that journey that are at Monticello. Also at the Smithsonian. Highly recommended book, as I said before, about the Lewis and Clark expedition, Undaunted Courage by Stephen Ambrose. It's a good one. All right, now, Madison, Secretary of State under Jefferson. Now what we're going to see moving forward in the early new nation is the stepping stone to the presidency isn't necessarily the role of vice president, but more so the role of Secretary of State. Elected from Virginia, inaugurated in D.C., like Jefferson. Jefferson and Madison are the first two presidents inaugurated in the Capitol. Remember, Washington was inaugurated in New York. And do you remember what city John Adams was inaugurated in? Philly. Very good. Nice job. Madison has two vice presidents. His first vice president was Jefferson's second vice president, George Clinton. And then his second vice president is Elbridge Gerry, which we've manipulated this guy's name when it comes to what is called gerrymandering. Has anyone ever heard that term before? Nice. Do you know what it is? Very good. Excellent job. So you like redraw district lines, like a politician will have, or a political party will redraw lines in favor of their candidate. It comes from this guy, Elbridge Gerry, who was from Essex, Massachusetts. In this area of Massachusetts, the lines were drawn and they kind of looked like a salamander, even though that salamander looks more like a dragon. And that's where gerrymandering comes from. Some of the important events, in Madison's time in office, the Battle of Tippecanoe, which occurred in Indiana. This was between U.S. military forces under the command of Virginian William Henry Harrison against the Shawnee Confederacy. Remember that Native American tribe we talked about that dominated Kentucky and the Ohio River Valley? They're going to go to war with the American forces. American forces will defeat the Shawnee at the Battle of Tippecanoe, killing their leader's brother, the Prophet. Tecumseh's brother, the Prophet. What's left of the Shawnee, Tecumseh, and those who survived this battle will fight with the British in the War of 1812. The War of 1812, destructive U.S. war against England. Most of the fighting occurred on American soil. Most of the destruction occurred here in America. And then finally, the Hartford Convention, which sounds like a meeting of like insurance agents, but it was actually a meeting of Federalists. And it's better explained at the end of the War of 1812. So I'm going to hold off on explaining the Hartford Convention, but it is the beginning of the end for the Federalist Party. Any questions up to this point? I think I'm doing well time-wise. Am I moving too fast? Everybody good? Cool. So the War of 1812. This war occurs between the U.S. and Britain for 4 reasons. This is a 2-year war-ish, roughly just shy of 2 years. It is fought for the following reasons. Impressment, kidnapping American sailors. Is this something new? Nope. When did the Brits start impressing or kidnapping Americans into service? When did we talk about that? Before what war? Very good. For the American Revolution. Okay? Well, this problem persisted. And this is basically like, hey, you're in the British Navy now. And you're like, I'm an American. No, come on aboard. You work for us now. All right? That's how that went down. Number 2, seizing American ships and the freedom of the open seas. Does anybody have any connection to Randolph-Macon College out there? Any Randolph-Macon folk? Nobody? That's fine. Well, usually like at least one person's like, yeah. Whatever. Randolph-Macon College, if you know what I'm talking about, north of Richmond, up in Asheville, named for John Randolph and Nathaniel Macon. Both of these guys served in Congress from Virginia. Nathaniel Macon, as a member of Congress, is going to write a bill known as, and you guys can add this note, Macon's Bill number 2. What Macon's Bill number 2 basically said, it was an ultimatum to France and Britain. Either stop messing with our ships or go to war. And France was like, we're good with that. We're cool. Britain, not so much. They ignore Macon's Bill number 2. And this is just one step closer to war. The British were supplying Western Native American tribes with weapons. In fact, many of the weapons that the Shawnee Confederacy had in the Battle of Tippecanoe had been gained from British support. And then lastly, division over Oregon. Are y'all familiar with Oregon? Yeah? Are you familiar with the Oregon Territory, though? Check it out. Follow the yardstick. This is the Oregon Territory originally. Oregon, Idaho, about a third of Montana, Washington, and all of British Columbia. That's the Oregon Territory. It was massive. Britain has a claim to it. And now, after the Louisiana Purchase, America's land claim to it. I do want you all to realize the Oregon Territory, that whole thing is not going to be settled until the 1840s. It's going to take time. We'll get to that toward the end of this lesson. So, most of these causes that we just discussed broke both the Treaty of Paris of 1783 and Jay's Treaty. Obviously, trade treaty brokered after the Revolution. British ships were kidnapping American sailors, stopping American ships in the open waters, and restricting American trade. Congress had a young group of members that were ready for war. We call them war hawks. That term's not going to go away. Two of the young, outspoken war hawks, Henry Clay from Virginia by way of Kentucky, and South Carolinian John C. Calhoun. We're going to talk a lot about these two guys later as we move forward. A war hawk, somebody that supports war. What is the name of the group of people who are against it? Another bird. Doves. Very good. So you have war hawks and you have doves. Look how close the vote was. 19 votes in the Senate for war, 13 against. It's a pretty narrow vote, okay? The war was roughly about 2 years-ish, just shy of 2 years. It actually spilled into 1815, even after it was over. Most of the fighting occurred in Canada, along the Atlantic, on the Great Lakes, and along the Mississippi. Cities that were affected in a major way, D.C. was burned, Baltimore was attacked, but it was really like spread out. I mean, the White House or the Executive Mansion was burned to the ground in August of 1814. America received the most damage, and it was fought on American soil. The Treaty of Ghent in Belgium ended the war on December 24th, 1814. What the treaty did was also split the Oregon Territory, but that official boundary was not determined until the 1840s through the Oregon Treaty. The U.S. is also going to go in the direction of pushing to buy Florida from Spain, but we're not going to get to that until next class. That happens during the Monroe administration. Now, as the war is coming to an end, a group of Federalists at the end of 1814 from New England are going to meet in Hartford, Connecticut, and they are going to propose a plan for the New England states to break away or secede and become a British province if the war does not end. Well, about how long do you think it took for the news to reach America that the war was over? It took a few weeks, right? The word that the war is over doesn't get to D.C. until January, because the treaty's brokered in December. By the time the representatives from the Hartford Convention showed up in D.C. to lay out their ultimatum, news that the war ended had gotten there before they had. So what do they look like a group of? Well, that, but they want to secede or break away from the country. Traitors. They look like a group of traitors. This is the end of the Federalist Party, or the beginning of the end. The Federalist Party will not be able to recover from this. All right. So, lasting legacies, yeah.
Did that affect like James Madison?
Nope, he's a Democratic Republican now. He's moved to the other party. Yeah, that's a great question. Nice job. All right. A lot of the Southern Federalists moved to the Democratic Republican Party. Lasting legacies. The legend of Uncle Sam, the guy that is like our symbol for patriotism, is actually a real guy. Sam Wilson, he was a butcher that supplied the army with meat during the war. First Lady Dolly Madison rescued the Gilbert Stuart portrait of Washington from the burning White House. That became famous. Also, Madison is our only sitting president to lead a military detail in combat. He led an artillery detail during the War of 1812 when Washington was attacked. Francis Scott Key wrote the Star Spangled Banner in what city? Anybody? What city did Francis Scott Key write the Star Spangled Banner? Farther north. Farther south. Baltimore. Very good. And the inner harbor of Baltimore. Rockets' red glare, bombs bursting in there, gave proof through the night that the flag was still there, and that flag was at Fort McHenry in Baltimore. Very good. Again, military dominance of Andrew Jackson. Do I have any Vols fans in the house? The Tennessee Vols, Volunteers, served with Andrew Jackson in the British defeat at the Battle of New Orleans. Funny, the battle occurred after the war was over, but they don't know that. It was kind of interesting. All this information almost simultaneously arrived in Washington. The Treaty of Ghent had been signed, the Hartford Convention people were threatening to secede, and Andrew Jackson has won the Battle of New Orleans. This catapults his celebrity and his political career. No one really wins this war. It's kind of a draw. But America comes out of it with more international recognition. There's a stronger sense of nationalism. And also, America and Britain come out of this thing and end up becoming trade allies. Pretty interesting. That's all I've got for today. Do y'all have any questions? Coolio. All right.